So I think clearly it's not lost on anyone in this room that this is the first conference we're having since the 7th of October. And, fair to say that's a day that will forever be marked in our collective memory. And it's quite bizarre for me when I think that more than 12 months ago, it was in August last year at our conference in Sydney, my mind was consumed by the divisions within the Jewish world. There were hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting on the streets of Tel Aviv about the proposed judicial reform. And at the time, I described my emotions as oscillating between despair and hope. And while everything has changed since the 7th of October, those two words strangely still seem to capture my emotions at the moment. And I can't help but compare the significance of this moment that we're in right now, with the aftermath of the Six-Day War. Back then, the Jewish world was in this euphoria from victory against all potential odds. And that euphoria breathed a new life into Jewish identity, into Zionism, igniting this surge of identity in Zionism that impacted and transformed diaspora Jewry, but in particular, our infrastructure, our organisations, our shuls, our schools, our fundraising bodies, including here in Australia. And today, in the wake of the 7th of October, instead of the euphoria that we felt then, I think we feel vulnerability, loss, and grief. And not a moment passes that we aren't thinking about that day, about the loss of life on that day, the images that flashed on our phones and our TV screens. And there isn't a moment that we aren't thinking of those still being held captive in the dungeons of Gaza. And of our brave IDF soldiers, many of whom are our brothers and our friends and cousins and families and nieces and nephews, who continue to fight a war on two fronts, more than two fronts. But amid the grief and the anguish, there is also a profound sense of hope. Hope that the hostages will return, hope that Israel will prevail, and hope derived from a profound sense of connection that we have to one another, that's been awakened throughout the Jewish world. There are days, I must confess, when the grief outweighs the hope. And none of us has the answers as to what is going to come. I certainly don't. But there are a few things that I do know. I know that both the State of Israel and diaspora Jewry have changed forever. I also know that we, collectively, each of us, have an opportunity to be a part of shaping how diaspora Jewry, certainly here in Australia, responds to these events and how we move forward together. When I assumed this role in 2018, so 6 years ago now, my priority was to broaden the tent, to make sure that everyone from the political left to the right, from the religious to the secular, had a seat at the table. I echoed President Rivlin, maybe got a bit sick of me echoing President Rivlin at the time, but I echoed his call to embrace our diversity and nuanced engagement with Zionism. And I quoted him when he said, "Complexity is not a plague, a lack of backbone. Complex people do not only vote for the centre, they vote for the right and for the left. Our complexity is what binds us together." Now, back then, when I quoted the president, the divisions were political. And of course, there are still political divisions today. But I genuinely believe that today it's not about the left or the right. It's about reaching the heart of our community. Those who may have previously felt detached and now recognise the depth and importance of their connection to Israel and their Jewish identity. And the question, I think, for us today as leaders of the community, for all of us, your affiliate, you're all leaders of your organisations and parts of the community, is how do we seize that moment? How do we harness this renewed sense of Jewish peoplehood and transform it into meaningful action? Now, some might say now's not the time. In 1948, Ben-Gurion said, "There is now nothing more important than war needs and nothing equal to war needs." And I believe that rings true today. That until Israel secures the release of the hostages, restores safety and returns displaced communities home, we live in today's urgency. But as Jews and as Zionists, we also live in the hope of tomorrow. And as Jewish leaders, I believe that we have an obligation to plan for tomorrow. And this is where the Zionist Federation and each of you, each of our affiliate organisation comes in. Just as in the Six-Day War, when it reshaped our relationship with Israel, so too does the 7th of October represent a transformative moment in the long history of Zionism. And this is why I am delighted that we've adopted the amendment that I just spoke to, aimed at bringing more voices around the table. And it's more than just a symbolic gesture. It's about reflecting the diversity and dynamism of our community. Just as in 1967, it reshaped our community, we now have a chance to build a more inclusive, legitimate and representative roof body for the whole Jewish community, one that embraces our rediscovered sense of Jewish peoplehood. When I visited Israel in November last year, together with UAA, I think it was one of the first or early solidarity missions. And it was actually just before the UAA mission started, I joined Gusti, you were there, I joined the WZO, we're starting also a mission, and we went to visit evacuees from the south who were staying at the Orient Hotel in Jerusalem. They were from Kibbutz Or Haner. And I had this moment where we go in, it's this bizarre experience, you walk in through the hotel and you see there's a makeshift creche for the children and kids running around in this 5-star hotel. You go to a conference room where you're used to sitting around for meetings. And as I sat down, my nephew was with me, who was the chair of the AZYC at the time, Gabe Max, and he sat on the corner of the table and next to him was this 65-year-old Buba, grandmother from the kibbutz. And before we could say hello, she turns around and she says to him, "Oh, you can't sit on the corner of the table, you won't get married for 7 years." And it sort of struck me at that moment that this woman, who from this kibbutz, who on paper we had very little in common with, they were country people. They told me that some of their children had never really been in the city and they were struggling with all the concrete and the lack of green spaces. They were completely secular, left-wing peaceniks. They did not, there was not a lot that would have had in common if we put it on paper. And yet, before I've even said hello, she's saying exactly the same thing that my mother or my grandmother would have said to my nephew. And it was a small but very, very powerful reminder that notwithstanding these differences, as Jews, we share something far deeper. It's that bond of peoplehood, and it transcends politics, and it transcends geography. And when we presented a statement of solidarity from the Jewish community and non-Jewish community to President Herzog on that trip, I quoted Rabbi Sachs, who said after the 6-Day War, "Being Jewish is not merely a private and personal matter, but something collective and historical. It means being part of an extended family, many of whose members we may never meet, yet to whom we feel deeply connected by bonds of kinship and responsibility." I thought that was very powerful. So that feeling of Jewish peoplehood that struck me so powerfully, the shared sense of identity and responsibility, I believe that is what's going to allow us all not just to survive, but to thrive. Zionism, after all, is not just about surviving. It is a rejection of the very notion that survival is enough. The Chalutzim, the pioneers, refused to accept an unacceptable reality. They understood that to merely survive was not sufficient. So they sought to extricate themselves and us from the confines of resilience and survival and to build something greater, a homeland, a future and a vision. And I think that is our collective challenge today, to ensure that the legacy of the 7th of October isn't one of just survival, but it's one of strength, of unity, of hope and determination. And I'm very grateful to everyone in this room, not just for coming today, but for the role that you've all played in the last 12 months, but most importantly for joining us on the journey now over the coming months and years so that we can ensure that at least our community here is built to meet the challenges of the future. Thank you.